Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. In his interim national security strategic guidance, U.S. President Joe Biden directly mentioned the threat posed by North Korea's growing nuclear and missile programs. He said the U.S. will empower its diplomats to reduce the threat. In the meantime, the International Atomic Energy Agency said North Korea has been showing signs of activities in its nuclear sites, saying such activities are a clear violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. Today, we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Ken Gause, the director of CNA's Adversary Analytics Program. Mr. Gause has spent the last 20 years examining leadership dynamics of authoritarian regimes. His latest book is North Korean House of Cards, Leadership Dynamics under Kim Jong-un. Ian Williams also joins me today. Mr. Williams is Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also the managing editor of the CSIS's website, Missile Threat, which analyzes missile proliferation and defense systems. Welcome to the program.
Nice to be with you.
Let's begin with President Biden's interim strategic guidance. He said the United States will empower its diplomats to reduce threats posed by North Korea. Does this signal Washington has started off its diplomacy towards North Korea?
I think they're still going through the examination of the strategy and the assessment of what the strategy toward North Korea will be. This, I think, is more a message to the allies, stating that we are, returning toward alliance management and focusing on the alliance. So it's to reassure them, I think, more so than a statement on what we would be doing with regard to North Korea.
Mr. Gause, there were some predictions that North Korea will likely turn to provocations in the beginning of the Biden administration. But so far, North Korea continues to keep a low profile. The regime doesn't seem to be sending any message to the U.S. either. Is this because it is more focused on domestic issues at the moment, or is it still waiting for the U.S. to make the first move?
Well, North Korea is focusing on a lot of internal issues right now. They have the sanctions, obviously. They have COVID they're having to deal with. Sending, provocations or tests in order to lay the groundwork for some sort of diplomatic engagement really isn't in the cards right now for North Korea, because they really can't engage the outside world. They're in a self-imposed lockdown. They are focusing on their nuclear program internally, but they're not testing. So I think that, for the most part, North Korea is going to stay quiet, at least for the time being. But if they end up doing a test, it probably will be driven by technology considerations inside the regime more so than diplomatic considerations.
All right. Mr. Williams, North Korea didn't stage any military provocations so far, except for showcasing its latest weapons during the military parade in January. What is your assessment on this current situation?
I think we are still in wait-and-see mode right now. It's still quite early in the year. It's not unusual to see North Korea not start testing until May or even later. So I do think much remains to be seen. One thing we did see 2 weeks ago was news that the United States had deployed the U.S. Navy ship Howard Lorenzen to the East Sea. This is a radar ship that the United States uses to gather intelligence on aerial threats. And we also saw the deployment of Cobra Ball, which is an aircraft that is used for the same purposes. So this, to me, gives some signal that at least U.S. intelligence believes they could be preparing for some kind of launch activity.
What about the possibility of a North Korean regime trying to test its weapons technology, as Mr. Gause said?
I certainly think it's very likely that we will see some kind of missile launch activity or military activity this year. Certainly, it has. If you look in the past, several years, there's only been 1 year, really, I think 2018, where they have not. They have refrained from any kind of testing. So certainly, if they went this entire year without any kind of missile launches or missile testing, it would be certainly quite unusual. The question is, what kind of provocations are we going to see? Are we going to see more testing of regional short-range missiles like we saw in 2020 or in 2019? Or are we going to see tests of some of the newer, larger ICBMs and SLBMs that we saw? I'm sorry, intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles that we saw paraded in January.
Mr. Gause, in the beginning of the year, Kim Jong-un doubled down on his nuclear ambitions, and now IAEA says North Korea shows a sign of a nuclear activity. There is also a news report North Korea trying to hide the nuclear-related facility. Some see this as an attempt to get attention from the U.S. What's your view on this?
I think it's probably more. I mean, they obviously are doing what they can do in terms of R&D, research and development, on their nuclear program, short of testing. But they're also, I think, sending strategic signals. They know that our intelligence satellites will pick up the activity around their nuclear installations. And so, you know, they're really kind of trying to get the U.S. attention, because they know the U.S. attention in foreign policy is really focused on China and Russia and Iran, and not so much North Korea. And as long as North Korea behaves itself and does nothing, the United States will not be paying that close attention. And I think that North Korea is trying to make sure that the new administration doesn't forget that they're there, and you know, they're very eager to see some indication by the Biden administration that they are willing to move away from the Obama administration's strategic patience to something a little bit more flexible, but they haven't seen any indication of it so far, other than some of the statements by Secretary of State Blinken. And I think they're looking for a more tangible, you know, signal from the United States. And in return, they're using, I think, their nuclear installations as a way of strategic messaging to the United States. Don't forget us.
Mr. Williams, I'm going to ask you the more technical side of North Korea's missiles. Most recently, North Korea showed off a new type of a submarine-launched ballistic missile during a military parade in January. North Korea's SLBM program has been considered relatively young and rudimentary. How do you assess the progress of the program?
Well, you know, it's interesting because, you know, so far under Kim Jong-un specifically, we have not seen North Korea display a missile before it has tested it. You know, the Hwasong 12, the Hwasong 14, the Hwasong 15, you know, these are the longer range missiles that North Korea tested in 2017. These missiles made their debut on the launch pad. These had not been seen prior to when they were fired. This is as opposed to in a parade, which we saw under the reign of Kim Jong-il, where we sometimes saw missiles in parades that ultimately never got tested. So it is unusual to see that these missiles have been displayed prior to being tested. I'm not sure what that indicates, whether that indicates that the weapons are a little bit immature and that they were looking for something to get the world's attention, so they decided to display them prematurely before the technology was fully ready. But, you know, based on what we can see, which is just based on, you know, physical observations of the missiles, you know, they're significantly larger than we have seen in the past, you know, particularly in terms of the payload area. This suggests that they may be capable of carrying multiple warheads, which would make them, you know, increase their lethality and make it a bit more difficult for missile defense systems to handle them, because there are simply more targets for the interceptors to have to go after. This would strain the capacity of interceptors, as well as challenge the sensors and radar systems in discerning what targets to go after. But, you know, it does make sense for me that they would be looking at a multiple warhead capability, given that, you know, the limited ability to produce large numbers of you know, intercontinental and SLBM missiles, and particularly on the SLBM side, on the submarine side, because it's likely they are not going to have many submarines if they ever actually deploy an operational ballistic missile submarine. And these submarines that we're seeing are maybe capable of carrying one or two submarine-launched missiles. So there is certainly a premium to be able to put more than one on each of these missiles. So it seems to me that's the direction that we're seeing their interest go. Now, where it's a little bit unclear as to the actual readiness of their reentry vehicle technology. You know, we have not seen them. We've seen them test multi-stage missiles. We've seen them test maneuvering reentry vehicles, but we haven't seen, I would say, a convincing test where we saw a reentry vehicle actually survive the kind of reentry that you would expect from an operationally realistic trajectory. So they could be putting the cart a little bit before the horse, but we'll have to really wait and see what they do this year in terms of testing and what they can demonstrate.
So, Mr. Williams, your assessment is that North Korea can miniaturize nuclear warheads, but still more to go to develop capability to survive re-entry?
It's the re-entry vehicle technology that will allow that warhead to be put into a capsule and survive the heat of re-entry. That warhead is going to be traveling through much greater part of the atmosphere and undergo much greater stresses than what we have seen from North Korean testing so far. What I am more concerned about is the type of fuel that they're using for their longer range intercontinental missiles. Right now, the missiles that they've displayed and tested are liquid fuel missiles. Right? These liquid fueled engines take a long time to prepare. This makes it very easy to detect preparations for an ICBM launch and then take potentially preventative action to prevent it from launching. Now, what we've seen last year is a much greater use by North Korea of solid fuel. This is in their short-range missiles, the things that we saw like the KN-23, like the Iskander lookalike, the KN-24, 25. These are solid fuel missiles, and solid fuel missiles can be fired within minutes of choosing to do so. There is no lengthy fueling process. Right now, we've seen them use solid fuel in short-range missiles, smaller missiles, but if they can scale that technology up into longer-range ICBM class missiles, we could see it become much more challenging for the United States to detect preparations for a launch and ultimately prevent a launch. This would put a lot more strain on U.S. missile defenses to be able to defend against this kind of threat. So that's what is a greater concern for me than necessarily the warheads or even a multiple warhead capability.
Mr. Gause, going back to the January Party Congress, Kim Jong-un did not exclude the possibility of having talks with the U.S. Is North Korea still willing to talk?
I think they do want to talk, but they want to talk under their own, in a situation that leads to them having leverage. Right now, they don't believe they would have the leverage. Obviously, they want a United States that is willing to make concessions up front. And if we're willing to do that, I think North Korea is willing to come back to the table. Obviously, COVID complicates things, but North Korea is not going to come back to the table unless it's on their own terms. And I think they've made that fairly clear that they are willing to shift in a different direction. It's not that they want to get closer to China. They really don't. They would prefer to be engaging with the United States and especially South Korea. But they're not going to do it if it means giving up significant portions of their nuclear program, which undermines the legitimacy of Kim Jong-un. And he only has a very fine thread of legitimacy as it is right now within the regime. And if he has to give that up, he's going to have some political problems he would have to deal with.
Mr. Gause, you said that North Korea will come out to the talks on their own terms. Does this include North Korea seeking a status as a nuclear power? If so, how do you think the U.S. will respond to this?
Well, I think they want to be a nuclear power to a certain extent because it does help the legitimacy within the regime. I think a lot of times we tend to focus or we tend to think about North Korea's nuclear program as being an offensive capability. I think it's primarily in their doctrine. Focus is more of a deterrent, but it's also has a heavy political piece to it, which is, as I said, the legitimacy piece. And, it would be interesting to see what would happen if all of a sudden they were starting to be able to develop their economy, how much the nuclear program would be front and center. I think it's front and center right now, no doubt. Can we get them off of that and wed them away from the nuclear program? I'm probably one of the few people that probably believes that that is a possibility, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. And it will take concessions on our part that are, they're very difficult to sell to the American people in order to get North Korea into that type of negotiation. We might be able to get them to make some concessions, some small concessions on Yongbyon and maybe even some of the other nuclear facilities. But we're not going to get them to give up things in a CVID kind of context in which they can't rebuild it.
Some experts suggest it is important for the Biden administration to send a message to North Korea early to keep the door open to diplomacy. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think they need to send a message to North Korea that the status quo is not going to hold, that we are going to try to develop a North Korea strategy that does have some flexibility. Because if North Korea has a certain amount of hope going forward that the United States might be willing to engage partly on their terms, then that might prevent them from doing things such as tests and other things to try to set the table for diplomacy.
Mr. Williams, how seriously should be the Biden administration taking North Korea's missile capability? Some missile experts warn it is only a matter of time before North Korea has the ability to target U.S. mainland with nuclear weapons. What is the most effective way to counter this, if that is true?
Well, I think the Biden administration has to assume that North Korea can target the United States mainland with nuclear weapons now. And in terms of how to counter it, it's a whole strategy. That there's no one silver bullet that's going to make this problem go away. General Hyten recently, who's the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, recently has been pushing left of launch approaches, which I think is good given the quantitative expand. We're seeing more and more missiles North Korea is producing and deploying. So looking at the ways of supplementing and augmenting active missile defenses is the right move. But when you're looking at things like cyber capabilities, electromagnetic things on the electromagnetic spectrum, sabotaging industrial production, these things are good and they can be effective. But ultimately, you don't know if they worked until it's too late, right? You don't know if they worked until the missile either launches or it doesn't. And at that point, if it does launch, then without another layer of defense, without another part of your strategy being active missile defenses, then the whole effort has ultimately failed. So each has its own strengths, has its own weaknesses, and the best approach is to use multiple approaches to kind of a missile defense and defeat strategy.
Mr. Gause, considering all these threats from North Korea's nuclear and missile program, do you think the Biden team will pursue a big package deal, just as the previous Trump administration did?
No, I don't. The Biden administration is a more conventional administration. I don't think that it has the political space in Washington to put together a huge deal for North Korea. Because in order to get to that huge deal, you're going to have to make some concessions up front to get North Korea to get the buy-in before you can make the deal. And it's hard to envision that either both Democrats or Republicans on Capitol Hill would be very supportive of a process like that, which I believe is, probably really not in the cards right now. Maybe on down the road it would be, but I don't think it is right now.
Blinken mentioned about the possibility of diplomatic incentives. What could they be?
Well, I mean, the diplomatic incentives that we tend to think about are not the types of diplomatic incentives that would resonate with North Korea. They're more about humanitarian aid and things like that. They're not about the big cash layouts that would go into the pockets of the elites and things like that, which I think is unfortunately probably fairly critical. If you're going to get North Korea invested into a negotiated process, they have to actually see what is in it for them. The United States is probably, they've talked about potentially putting some sort of security guarantees. North Korea's primary focus right now is on economic resources, not security guarantees. Security guarantees is a good thing, and it could be part of a package. But, just kind of not exercising vigorously on, joint exercises on the peninsula, toning those down, promising, not to, attack or do anything against North Korea. None of this is really going to work because we don't have the trust value right now. So North Korea is more focused on the economic relief than they are on security guarantees. And that's probably not where the United States is right now.
U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said North Korea's nuclear program is an issue that can be dealt with at the UN Security Council. And the Biden team continues to make it clear that the U.S. will engage in a principled diplomacy together with allies in order to press towards a denuclearized North Korea. Mr. Gause and Mr. Williams, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.